Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 234, Phil Sheridan. Last time we talked about the Battle of Secessionville. In another one of our Redux episodes, we actually had a little bit more on a battle that maybe on the surface didn't necessarily seem to be too important, but at the time, at least in 1862, was a little bit more of an important event, especially in association with some of the events that were happening around it, right? So in connection to, say, the things that were happening in Richmond and the things that were happening or recently had happened, I guess we should say, with the fall of New Orleans and Shiloh, Secessionville, right there outside of Charleston, was a little bit more important on scale, especially with some of these early battles. There's a little bit more fanfare. We look at the casualty figures. It's one of these battles that doesn't really get a whole lot of play in the Petersburg string of engagements that we talked about in 64, 65. It's just kind of like another one of those that we don't really have a whole lot to go off of when we talk about them, but still, at least in the earlier stages of the war, a little bit more important. As we continue our analysis series, I think we need to move on to a man that we're going to be discussing this week. Oftentimes, I will mention the pillars of the Union Army and who should be included in terms of who helps to win the war. Grant, Sherman, Meade maybe, George Thomas. But one name that makes the list, I think based off of one campaign and then his post-war fame, is Philip Sheridan. Before we talk about Little Phil, though, let's get into some Patreon content. And of course, we do have another episode that's been posted this month. We went back to movie review and we did The Outlaw Josie Wales, another Clint Eastwood film. We've done a couple of Clint Eastwood films here. This is another Western style, of course, with Clint. And if that sounds like it would interest you, of course, we've done some other ones. Good, Bad, the Ugly, of course, with Clint. And amongst others, we've done memoir reviews, picture slideshows. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. Surprisingly, Phil Sheridan actually made an appearance early on in our narrative. I think the part that does sort of discount him for me is that it takes a while for him to really make an impact. And then when he does, it's sort of a mixed bag. It really should not be too much of a surprise, as I think as we went along, there was not the same ring to Sheridan as other generals for the Union like, say, Grant, or George Thomas, or even William Stark Rosecrans for that matter. As we will talk about it, really, it's not his fault that it takes him a long time to really get into the spotlight, as everyone has their own journey. Were there any battles that you can point to and say, wow, that was a great tactical masterpiece Little Phil turned in there? Well, maybe not. But much in the same way Longstreet fails in independent command, Sheridan will excel in his brief tenure. Now, would we have maybe been singing a different tune if Longstreet had somehow forced Burnside into open battle at Knoxville and then beat him? This is something to consider for sure. I think I talked about it at the conclusion of the 64 Valley campaign that Sheridan gets these big wins, and sometimes it's about being a winner versus losing, or even doing nothing at all. We can make a pretty strong comparison with him and Sherman, so maybe he should have been included in that joint episode, but I think that one flowed a little bit better with Kump and the old snapping turtle Meade. I mentioned it when we talked Ulysses S. Grant in his episode, though, that in some ways the importance of guys like Sherman and Sheridan is that they fit very well as a subordinate to lists. In many ways, if you allow me a sports analogy, I think this is like the '04 Pistons. Now, if you follow basketball, or maybe if you don't, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, the '04 Pistons were the last team to win an NBA championship that did not really have a true superstar, or at least they were widely considered to be the last one that did not have a true superstar. There was no Michael Jordan or LeBron James on that team, and that's not to say they were not good, but their starting five was so complementary that they were able to beat the LA Lakers, who still had two of the greatest players of all time, in Kobe and Shaq, as well as Hall of Famers like Karl Malone and Gary Payton. But I digress. Now, was that the last year that Shaquille O'Neal played for the Lakers, and then he went on to Miami, and then he won a championship in Miami? Yes, that's true. We can also probably say that there was some dysfunction with that Lakers team, and obviously Shaq and Kobe were not really getting along at that point, and there needed to be a split with that duo. Sure, and maybe the Pistons took advantage of that. Fine. We can probably have an argument there. We could talk about basketball all day, but you get the idea. The point is that Sheridan is an important part of the starting five that Brant is going to bring to the floor. Is he the Tayshaun Prince of Union Generals, the Rasheed Wallace maybe, because he could be a bit prickly? I think so. I think the team does not work without someone like Sheridan, and there lies the importance. You have a couple of officers who are sort of similar of mind and are able to execute the plan. We need only look at the 64 Valley campaign to understand that Sheridan will at least particularly share in Grant's objective for Lee's army, destruction of the force as a viable enemy. While we will certainly talk about this campaign and how these battles might have turned out very differently, I usually think that Sheridan is the right guy for the job at the right time. Sometimes that's really all it comes down to, right? Is that by the time we get to 64, we've weeded out a lot of these generals that have either unfortunately been kind of attrition through casualties or attrition through incompetence or otherwise performance related issues. So we definitely get to a point where we have kind of the cream of the crop, or at least in some cases actually really there's really only individuals who are only there because there's not a whole lot of people who can actually lead forces in the field in some cases, but we do get some very capable individuals who are going to be left standing there at the end of the day. The origins of Sheridan are oddly enough a mystery. Many places consider him to be a native son. Somerset, Ohio, Albany, and even Ireland all lay claim. What we do know is that Phil's parents were both Irish, immigrating to America either shortly after or before his birth. His sister would actually die in the crossing attempt. Once in the United States, eventually the family would settle in Somerset, which is a little east and south of Columbus. Sheridan's youth included him being considered quite the scrapper, which would explain some of his actions later in life. Eventually, he would obtain an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy through local congressmen. Once there, Phil, much like Stonewall Jackson, would have to catch up a bit when it came to general education. Famously, Sheridan would bump heads with William Terrell, who will go on to serve in the Union Army, dying at Perryville. Little Phil would try to run him through with a bayonet on the parade ground for the slight of Terrell asking him to close rank, Sheridan believing he had properly closed the distance. Not expelled, Sheridan would be suspended and spend some time back in Ohio. That's actually kind of crazy when you think about it. You try to run a classmate of yours through with a bayonet. Like, what do you have to do to get expelled? Yeah, it's kind of a boys will be boys situation here. It's definitely a different time, right? His class of 1853 would include not only Terrell, but John Bell Hood, Schofield, and William Suey Smith, amongst other future officers. Upon graduating, Sheridan would be assigned the infantry, moving first to Texas and then to the Pacific Northwest. Once there, Sheridan would participate in the wars against the Cascades and Yakima, amongst other tribes in this region. We have talked about how this conflict will continue on into the Civil War, it being actually fairly brutal and not well known as, say, the wars against the Plains tribes. Sheridan would adopt his aggressive tactics, including wanting to move dragoons behind a potential target, effectively pincering them. He would be slightly wounded during a scouting expedition and perform well in capturing hostiles. Winfield Scott would actually write on the good action of Lieutenant Sheridan during this time. Still in the Pacific Northwest, when the conflict started brewing in the east, Sheridan would benefit from the Southern officers beginning to drop out and join the Confederate cause. He would rise to the rank of captain as a result. So Sheridan is also like William Tecumseh Sherman, some of these other general officers that we've talked about, whether it's Lee, Grant, Longstreet, certainly, they get some pretty valuable combat experience in the war with Mexico, whereas Sheridan does not participate in that conflict. Obviously, 1853 is going to be after that war, so like some other officers that we've talked about throughout the narrative, there is going to be very limited opportunity to actually get combat experience in probably the Euro sense of the word, right? So you're going to have kind of this experience on the frontier, whether that is on the plains, right? You could be fighting Comanches or, Seminoles, right, in Florida, or in Sheridan's case, it's actually a pretty valuable experience kind of in this hit and run style tactics. If you're a cavalry officer or kind of evolving into a cavalry officer, like say a Nathan Bedford Forrest, and we know he doesn't actually serve necessarily in a combat capacity or has any military experience prior to the Civil War, but certainly he does have kind of this experience that does mold his activity in the war, how he actually ends up tactically looking at things in a cavalry sense when he does get to that point. Sheridan also has this experience that will start to mold how he looks at things when he does get there. Sherman also does not participate in the war with Mexico. Obviously, we talked about him, how he actually gets shipped out to California. And in his experience is a little bit different. He actually has the relationship piece of things. And that's also another piece of the puzzle that I do want to eventually maybe talk about, where we have Sheridan with his experience prior to the war, and then we also have Sherman with his relationship piece of things. He has that kind of connection to Halleck that he creates, and that's also a valuable piece to the puzzle, where everyone has these little things that are just coming together to kind of weave into this kind of tapestry that becomes this officer group that succeeds finally for the Union. Early in the war, Sheridan would find himself in the West. He would first be in a position where he was cleaning up for John C. Fremont in Missouri. Now, if you recall from our early narrative episodes, Fremont was not behaving in Missouri. There were a lot of accusations of corruption. Fremont wanted to go ahead with emancipation, much like Hunter tried to do in South Carolina, this being before Abraham Lincoln was ready for it. Fremont also had weird things about him, like a personal guard not associated with the army, some kind of mercenary group. As such, Sheridan would find no luck in advancing himself here. While he did a good job in a staff capacity, as he had been working books before for his family, this was not the route that he wanted to take. It seemed like Sheridan would continue down this path as he became the quartermaster general for Samuel Curtis and his campaign for Pea Ridge. As we know, this was no easy task, the region of southern Missouri and northern Arkansas being sparsely populated and not good for foraging. Sheridan would miss Shiloh, but find himself attached with Halleck and his push on Corinth. It would be during this campaign where he would find himself given a combat command. Future Secretary of War Russell Alger was looking for an experienced officer to lead the 2nd Michigan Cavalry. Little Phil seemed to be a good choice for this post. The 2nd Michigan would also have Gordon Granger as eventual colonel, so 2 pretty high-profile officers leading them at some point. Sheridan would lead this regiment and a regiment of Iowa cavalry against rebels under James Chalmers and his rebel cavalry brigade. At Boonville, Sheridan would see pretty heavy action, facing pressure from these Southern horsemen. At a pivotal moment in a battle, a train would arrive, seeming like there were reinforcements on hand. The outnumbered Federals would charge, scattering the enemy. Sheridan, who had been ordered to withdraw, would famously reply that since he had the field, he saw no reason to withdraw. He would see much support in elevating to brigadier general as a result. While catching the eye of Grant, who if you recall would remain in Mississippi, he would wish to move on to action in Tennessee. At this time, he would obtain his famous horse Rienzi, named after a town in Mississippi. So Sheridan would then find himself in the service of Bull Nelson. If you recall, at this point, there had been more activity shifting to Tennessee and eventually then into Kentucky. Buell's army would be making preparations to capture Chattanooga, but that was going to be thwarted. Kirby Smith and Bragg would invade Kentucky, although Bragg really does not have a good idea of what he wants to do once he gets there. Nelson's going to be murdered by Jefferson Davis, Sheridan having obtained an infantry command in the meantime. He would parlay his experience to elevate to division command, especially when Charles Champion Gilbert is given a corps command. Sheridan is actually pretty miffed that Charles Champion Gilbert is given this corps command experience. There's a lot of officers who are actually pretty miffed that Charles Champion Gilbert is given corps command. As you recall in our narrative episodes, we were kind of like, who is this guy? And there were a lot of individuals in a contemporary sense who were like, yeah, who is this guy? And then he kind of appears and then he disappears pretty quickly in our story. At Perryville, Sheridan is going to be part of Gilbert's corps, which doesn't really have a whole lot to do. They would fend off an attack from Confederates, but are not going to be allowed to counterattack. This would probably have been the coup de grace of the battle if Gilbert's corps had advanced across the Chaplin River and into the rebel rear. Terrell, who reportedly reconciled with Sheridan prior to the battle, would be killed in the fighting. It's actually another thing that there's reportedly this great reconciling between the two officers and kind of this premonition of what's going to happen on the next day. And there's a lot of things in Sheridan's story that are kind of fantastic, sort of. And whether or not there's this meeting and what is the degree of that is always kind of questionable in my mind. Sheridan always has this kind of, maybe there are these things that happen in his story where you could be like, okay, maybe you were there, maybe you said something. There's always these things that are thrown in where he's kind of like making himself look good, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like, you can't really knock the guy for trying to advance himself, but there's all these moments in his story that you can kind of see where it's pretty blatant, where you're like, okay, you're trying to make yourself look good, right? And it kind of comes out in Sheridan's story, I think, more so than other general officers, at least in my opinion. So that's kind of like, I know I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here with Sheridan, but I think I'm a little bit negative on him sometimes, and perhaps if you've listened to past episodes, you've picked up on that, but I think that's also where it comes from a little bit. While the rebels will hold their objective, at the end of the day, they really only engaged McCook's corps, so Bragg is going to withdraw. As the army moved back into Tennessee, Rosecrans would arrive to take over command of the Army of the Cumberland. At the end of 1862, moving into 1863, Sheridan would still be with the army in division command, facing Confederates at Stones River. He would be under McCook in the right wing of the army, along with Richard Johnson and Jefferson Davis. While the Union troops formed a plan to attack the Confederates, Bragg would beat them to the punch. If Sheridan had his division a little bit further on the right flank, he might have been victimized in the same way that these other two divisions were, but fortunately for him, he was a little bit more aligned in the center. Hardee had rolled up the Federals in this flank assault. Sheridan, though, would make his stand, refusing his line to meet this new threat, his troops holding off the Confederates at the Slaughter Pen. His division would continue to help form the defensive line around the Round Forest, or Hell's Half Acre. To show the fierce nature of the fighting, on a day that would see the highest percentage of casualties in a battle during the war, all three of Little Phil's brigade commanders would be killed during the fighting, and one replacement is killed as well. The regiments that made up this division, though, were veteran units, many of whom were Illinois and Missouri troops who had fought at Pea Ridge. They would perform well at Stones River, a much-needed Federal victory as Bragg withdrew further into Tennessee. There's a very short list of officers that you can point to at Stones River that performed particularly well, right? And maybe a fourth if you add artillery under Mendenhall, but for the final day at least, you could say that Rosecrans performs well. This is probably his best battle, is able to stave off this Confederate assault and win the day when all is said and done. George Thomas, of course, and then Philip Sheridan, right? Philip Sheridan is probably the third individual that you can say really does perform particularly well at Stones River. The Tullahoma campaign would follow, with the Rosecrans moving his army around the Confederates, capturing Tullahoma, but then eventually Chattanooga as well without a major battle. Sheridan's division would see action at Chickamauga following that. His command would be involved in stopping Hood's attack on the first day, but then will be victimized by the famous break in the Federal line on the second. Sheridan's command was the closest to Rosecrans and his headquarters, and would try to stave off the rolling of their line, but the pressure was too great. Additionally, they would be present when Wilder's command, which might have turned the tide of the battle, was removed from the field by Charles Dana. While McCook, Crittenden, and Rosecrans were back in Chattanooga, Sheridan would lead remnants of his command to join Thomas. Now, to what extent he got to Thomas, or whether this was just a good story, Sheridan told to try to make himself sound better, well, this is up for debate. Reportedly, Sheridan would link up with Thomas and share a drink with his fellow officer after the near total disaster that had befallen the Army of the Cumberland. So there you go. You have another example of, even though there is a poor battlefield performance, or at least on paper a poorer battlefield performance, Sheridan is going to say, well, I got to Thomas and I was able to, I had a flask for him and we shared a drink, and, we were able to talk about how I was right there with the Rock of Chickamauga and we shared a drink and talked about how terrible it was at the, the Army, what befell the Army, and, Sheridan wasn't even really there at the end of the day, right? So it's just another example of how he's kind of making himself sound better, right, in this situation. Now, Chickamauga really is an example of how Sheridan is not particularly the best battlefield leader in some cases. One thing that cannot be denied is that he is always in the thick of things, inspiring the troops, though. Several accounts have Sheridan animated during these engagements. That being said, there was not a whole lot for him to do, which really was not the same for other officers at Chickamauga. Once the line breaks, unless you are Thomas and your more lightly engaged command, then you are not in a position to make an impact any longer. So there is that. Moving on to Chattanooga, his command would be part of the 4th Corps under Gordon Granger. So there you go. He's actually linked back up with another former commander of that 2nd Michigan Cavalry there, Gordon Granger. These men would rush the heights of Missionary Ridge in the famous assault that is going to lift the siege, save the city, kind of almost break the back of the Confederate Army. Certainly it is going to send Braxton Bragg away from the Army, is going to send him into a kind of a back channel job here when all is said and done. Now, the Confederates do a good job in helping the Union attack by mixing up where their earthworks were and not using the military crest of the ridge, but the determination of the 4th Corps troops to try to redeem themselves was a powerful wave. Sheridan would claim to have captured several artillery pieces, where William Babcock Hazen would also claim some of them as well. They would bicker over who it was who had captured them, both providing supporting material from staff officers and fellow officers as well. Those are two individuals who like to talk about themselves. William Babcock Hazen is always volunteering his troops for stuff that's going to make him look good. Certainly. So I'm not surprised at all when I've read accounts of these two individuals arguing about whose artillery pieces were captured. That's actually another interesting thing that I've pointed out maybe before, but I'll point out again, is that, with the kind of like the confusion of battlefields and troops moving wherever they are, and you could have a battery, and if it gets overrun, a lot of times you could actually overrun the same battery several times. So it's very likely that these individuals were talking about the same cannon and they're just confused, right? And they, like, maybe Sheridan's troops rolled over it and then Hazen's coming from one direction and it kind of seems like they both captured it. It's very possible that maybe that is the case here, but it's just kind of interesting. Like these two individuals they certainly would be the two candidates that I would think of if I read down a list of the commanders of this particular corps on this day, that would probably argue who it was that captured these pieces. Sheridan, though, would be part of the Union troops who would try to finish off Bragg and his army as they fled. Now, again, I think maybe Sheridan was trying to capitalize for personal gain here, but famously, He would urge Granger to follow for reinforcements should he run into any determined defense. If you're little Phil, this is kind of like a high percentage attempt for you. You are chomping at the bit to get out after them. The Confederate army is already defeated, so why not try to continue? Once again, Sheridan is going to be in the midst of his attacking troops, reportedly at one point taking fire from rebel artillery. Now, Sheridan is going to winter with his division on Strawberry Plains, chasing after Longstreet, who, if you recall, had stuck around in Tennessee for a period of time. But it was not Little Phil's destiny to remain with the army, although he had perhaps been tabbed to remain with Sherman's army group for higher command prospects. No, he had made a name for himself in front of Grant, first in Mississippi and then again at Chattanooga. He would be given command of the cavalry for the main theater of the war. Fortunately for Sheridan, this was coming at the turning point for the mounted arm for the North. Repeating carbines were being issued for them, and thus Sheridan, who had witnessed Wilder's command at Chickamauga, would be at the beginning of the mobile offensive force. The Wilderness would see some action, as we know Custer, amongst others, engaging with the Confederate forces. Sheridan, though, would start to bump heads with Meade fairly or unfairly, pretty much from the outset. At Spotsylvania, Sheridan is credited with the aggressive cavalry move to make the courthouse and beat Confederate troops there, but conflicting orders would make it so not only would the cavalry not check a key advance point, but also that Sheridan had sort of superseded his orders and then made it so Warren's corps would be late in arriving on the first day, unable to dislodge Jeb Stuart before the Confederate First Corps arrived. Anderson, as we know, was marching through the night, so this is kind of part of the problem, as Anderson, if he had chosen to bivouac, this wouldn't have been part of the problem, but as we know, he continues marching, and then he's able to get to the Laurel Hill region, and then we know Spotsylvania then kind of rolls out from there. Sheridan, of course, is going to argue with Meade about this mix-up. Now, usually people point to the positive nature of Sheridan and his aggressive action, but there is also a point to be made that he could have supported the infantry better and not tried to take their place, and then Spotsylvania might have turned out very different. Famously, though, Sheridan was set out to release the aura of invincibility of Jeb Stuart. His entire cavalry column would stake its way to the outskirts of Richmond and engage with the famous Southern Cavalier. Now, you could argue that removing the cavalry was almost a disaster at, say, Jericho Mills and North Anna. Remember that in both of those situations, right, it's kind of the actual missed opportunity, really, of the overland campaign. Not a whole lot of casualties in either of those situations, but at Jericho Mills, the 5th Corps almost gets completely cut off. Would have been nice to have cavalry there, right? And then at the North Anna, on the other side of things, the flip side of things, the 2nd Corps almost gets completely cut off. Again, might have been nice to have cavalry there, right? They almost run into earthworks as well, pretty strong earthworks. So, might have been nice to have some eyes on that, and this is kind of a knock on Sheridan. So we could definitely point that out and say, it might have been nice to at least leave some kind of cavalry with them. You needed the whole force to go and take out Jeb Stuart. It did not take a tactical master to overwhelm Jeb Stuart at Yellow Tavern and then see him mortally wounded. Sheridan then would ride and join Butler before refitting for Grant. His move toward Trevilian Station would leave the Confederate cavalry weakened in the face of the main army as it moved toward Petersburg. Trevilian Station was sort of a mess for both sides, the second largest cavalry battle of the war. Custer is going to find himself surrounded at one point, which he might have avoided, the rest of the cavalry having to put pressure on Wade Hampton to save him. You'd think that Custer might have learned a little bit from that experience, but 1876 is certainly so a couple of years later, maybe he forgot. But at the conclusion, the action was deemed a draw, Sheridan making his way back to friendly lines, but once again being harassed on his way there. Much like Sherman, Sheridan would start to see the benefit of harder war, it beginning in the central part of Virginia before his eventual Valley campaign. We also have established a behavior of Sheridan bumping heads with his superior and taking liberties with his orders. With Sheridan doing a good job with the cavalry, it only makes sense that he might see his star rise to the point where he is commanding beyond just the mounted arm. It is in his next opportunity where we see him truly evolve that same cavalry to act in concert offensively with infantry, which is usually credited to Little Phil as being his big tactical contribution to the war. I will put a caveat on it in saying that it was actually James Wilson who gave the capability to the cavalry by making the Spencer repeating carbine their primary weapon. From there, they could stand toe-to-toe with anyone. At this point in the war, the numbers and the technological advances are going to be throwing their weight for the North. But Sheridan would be tabbed with commanding the army in the Valley, which would include the 6th Corps, the West Virginia contingents, and part of the recently arrived corps from the failed Red River campaign. In all, it would give him some 40,000 men to operate with. His primary opponent would be Jubal Early, as mentioned in the previous narratives. Early had moved north, and Grant had been sort of lazy in sending Horatio Wright and his 6th Corps to begin with, but now Early remained in the Valley and also remained close to raid northern cities. It was truly something that needed to be addressed. We talked before about how there were others who considered for this role, but it's going to be Sheridan who's going to be given the call. Right, Meade is also on the short list of people who could be given this task. Can't really do that, though. It's going to be seen as a demotion for him. Probably would have been better for Meade if he had been given this independent command. And it kind of also shows you that it's kind of with reluctance that Grant's like, well, I kind of could give this to Sheridan. I don't really want to. I'd rather keep the dream team together, right? I want to the 04 Pistons, right? We got to have all our guys on the floor here. But in the same vein, it's like, well, if I have him commanding this army, I already had this situation where I had Butler and Franz Siegel, and that was not the dream team, right? This is not the guys that I want on the floor, certainly. So I definitely have this guy that I can trust, and I know he's going to get the job done. Sheridan is going to use intelligence effectively in the Third Battle of Winchester, although Grant had arrived to kind of prod him into action, as the administration was frustrated at the potential lack of action. His plan almost unraveled when Horatio Wright still hung on to his ammunition train and clogged the road. This gave Early time to reorganize his troops and mounted defense. Now, as we mentioned, we do not know whose idea it was to add the additional pressure of Crook's West Virginia army. His mounted creepers were just enough combined with federal cavalry that's going to win the day for the Union. Crook and Sheridan are going to feud after the war. The situation would not improve as Fisher's Hill would see Crook again shine in a flank maneuver on a weak part of the line. Now, we mentioned before that this was a puzzling deployment by the Confederates, as the weakest troops are going to be on the most vulnerable part of the line. Doesn't really make sense. From there, Sheridan is going to start the burning of the valley, him deciding that he's going to perform much in the same way as Sherman. This region of Virginia was indeed a problem. There's going to be a pretty high and steady guerrilla activity, and be a good resource for food for the Confederates. While the severity of the burning would vary, it would prove to be very successful in removing this as an asset for the Southern cause. So then we have Grant wanting Sheridan to maybe press the issue and continue through the valley gaps to Charlottesville. Little Phil, though, is going to continue to be liberal with his orders and sort of drag his heel on the potential route. Early was still somewhere in the vicinity, and despite efforts to eliminate their impact, the partisans are still going to be open for business and making things difficult for Sheridan and his army. We can see the negative effect of Sheridan and his performance, where he ends up going to Washington. He would be in Washington when Early strikes his army at Cedar Creek. For the first half of that battle, Early might have won a victory on par with Richmond, Kentucky, considered to be one of the more one-sided battles of the war for the Confederates. We spoke of the battle in the narrative, but in many ways, Early loses Cedar Creek as opposed to Sheridan winning. But, much in the same way that we talked before about, say, Chickamauga, say, Stones River, Sheridan does a good job of rallying his men and then launching not only infantry, but also cavalry at the Confederates to win the day. Shortly after the battle, Thomas Buchanan Reed would pen Sheridan's Ride, which would become very popular. And here we have the poem in its entirety. Shoed the steed with silver that bore him to the fray, when he heard the guns at Drawning, miles away. when he heard them calling, mount, nor stay. Quicker all is lost. They surprise and storm the post. They push your routed host. Gallop, retrieve the day. House the horse in ermine, for the foam flake blew, wide through the red October. He thundered into view. They cheered him in the looming, horseman and horse they knew. The turn of the tide began. The rally of bugles ran. He swung his hat in the van. The electric hoof, spark flew. Wreathed the steed and lead him, for the charge he led. Touched and turned the cypress, into Amoress for the head. Of Philip, king of riders, who raised him from the dead. The camped, at dawning lost, by eve, recovered, forced. Rang with laughter of the host, at belated, early fled. Shroud the horse in sable, for the mounds they heap. There is firing in the valley, and yet no strife they keep. Is in the parting volley, is in the pathos deep. There in the glory for the brave, who lead in noble save, but no knowledge in the grave, where the nameless followers sleep. Now, John O. Castler especially refuted the fact that Sheridan rode all the way. Little Phil would be promoted to the rank of Major General as a result, though, a pretty meteoric rise. For someone who was just trying to make his name as a cavalry officer not too long ago, an army leader who has had 3 solid victories under his belt is definitely a surprise. He would continue, though, to sort of take liberties with his orders as Grant wished for an assault on Lynchburg. As we remember, David Hunter had previously been checked there by Early, that being a key railroad hub. It would have potentially been an important part of a retreat for Lee's army. But Sheridan is going to hold off on that move as well. In 1865, he is going to hit Early at Waynesboro, Custer showing his battlefield capability at this place, albeit to a much reduced in morale and numbers Confederate force. From there, Sheridan would rejoin Grant's army. He was concerned that the war would end without more glory, which also kind of lines up with what we have listed about him and how he wants to add to his reputation. He would get into an interesting situation as he considered to be the hero of Five Forks. Now, he does relieve Warren from his command, a questionable decision, but Five Forks is also an important victory to the eventual evacuation of Richmond and an end to the Petersburg campaign. This is another case of Sheridan facing subpar performers on the other side. He does ride out in front of his command at one point, adding to this case. Also, he kind of leads from the front, right? It's also kind of a common theme with Sheridan is that he's able to rally his troops. You see it time and time again. Again, Cedar Creek and all these other battles that he had in the subtheater of the war, he does it again at Five Forks. This cavalry would be a big part in running down Lee once the Army of Northern Virginia starts to try to make its escape. They would capture key supplies and help box him in, leading to the eventual surrender at Appomattox. Sheridan, always true to his goal of advancing himself, would boast that he would have destroyed the Confederates if they had held out a little longer. This pattern of behavior is what I believe we can come to expect from Little Phil. After Appomattox, Sheridan is going to be tabbed with a potential link-up with Sherman, although he didn't really want that. Indeed, he would resist being sent to Texas. Grant and the administration, especially following Lincoln's assassination, were wished for a strong general there, who might be potentially aggressive given the violence along the border with the French and the Mexican rebels. Sheridan would not have a good time in Texas, that state continuing to operate essentially as status quo, with some continued violence. We've talked about that before in the Texas and New Orleans. See some unrest following the war and violence against African Americans. Sheridan would be given the task that might have been more up his alley in the ongoing wars against the Plains tribes in Texas and Kansas. He would instruct his trusted subordinate George Armstrong Custer to attack winter encampments on the Washita. Sheridan was prepared to wage war like he had against the Confederates, elimination of support systems, and lightning strikes when otherwise his enemy thought he was safe. Now, there would be a heap of criticism on Sheridan for some of his tactics against the Plains tribes, notably the killing of women and children. And that's actually a pretty big one. Custer was part of this, and a handful of other incidents would draw ire in the East while heaping some praise in the West. Sheridan would have his last campaign in the field following the Washita. He would be shifted to Washington for some time as Sheridan took the reins of commanding the U.S. Army on Grant's ascendancy to president. Sheridan would take a break to go absorb the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and then take a tour of Europe. Upon his return, he would set up his headquarters in Chicago. During that time, there was a great fire, the Great Fire in Chicago, Sheridan's home being spared the flames. Several families of friends of Sheridan would take shelter at Little Phil's home, which included Daniel Ruckles, Army quartermaster, and his daughter Irene, who would become Sheridan's wife. He was still an eligible bachelor in his late 30s at this point. He would be married in 1875 and have a handful of children, including a set of twins. Sheridan's campaigns against the Plains tribes would continue in the interim. Cavalry would launch their failed campaign that resulted in the Little Bighorn and the death of Sheridan's trusted Lieutenant Custer. Sheridan's campaigns would continue to be criticized, though. He was reported to have been quoted as having said that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. Now, this is actually a misquote, but it is actually not too far off of what he actually said, and obviously, once that's in the paper, it's not good. He would start to do work in preserving Yellowstone as a national park and not a commercial center, or hunt to the degree that the rest of the West was becoming. In this, I think we get into the softer Sheridan, who would at least turn things around slightly toward advocating more leniency for tribes, especially when it came to reservations and treatment on them. This did not mean that when Sheridan became the commanding general of the U.S. Army, he did not issue George Crook to execute a harder war to bring the Apache in the Southwest to heel. Crook had been partially blamed by Sheridan for Custer's annihilation at the Little Bighorn, which added to the feud between the two. Sheridan would die of heart complications in 1888 and be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. So what final conclusions can we draw on Phil Sheridan? As mentioned, he does have a strong rise through the ranks from captain to major general. He does turn in good performances. On a day at Stones River that needed to be a Union victory, he does a good job in helping to save the rolling of the entire Union line so that the defensive position could be established at Round Forest. He does not really have any great battlefield performances that show his capability when it comes to tactics, though. Chickamauga is a victim, same as other officers, though. Chattanooga is more the rebels collapsing than anything. We've highlighted in the Valley and in his cavalry actions that he always has more troops, and that seems to be the extent of his tactics. Crook, some say, was more capable as a battlefield leader. What we cannot deny, though, is that what is recorded in many places is that he did have the intangibles much in the same way as other leaders that we have discussed. That intangible is that the ability to inspire and rally his troops, leading them to good performances. The cavalry had its morale rise with him. The Valley Campaign, notable at Cedar Creek, has inspired troops to return to the field. Even at Five Forks, he's able to get the 5th Corps troops back into position to roll up Pickett. That's where I think he has a very good value. We talked about his ability to be on the same page as Grant at the top of the episode. That becomes a deadly combination for the Southern cause. So we'll call it a day right there. Hopefully you'll have a better idea of Sheridan and his performance. In the narrative, it kind of seemed like he was not around until Yellow Tavern, and then we had a more in-depth look. Next time, we'll turn back to secret missions of the war and read a couple of accounts on them. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the Patreon as well as the website. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening and have a great week.